Alright, so to start baking, you have to do a couple things. Number one is you're going to have to connect all your stuff together for your low poly. Um, keep a backup file of all your stuff separated out before you start attaching everything. It's not a big deal to have to deattach stuff. I mean, they're all just elements. So we're going to try and bake everything at once. It's usually what I do. I'll try and attach all my shit, do one bake, and see if it works. And if I run into issues, then I'll start breaking my stuff up and doing things. So if I notice like this monitor is getting like some of this monitor on here or some shit, um, then I'll detach this monitor, bake it separately. Sometimes, especially with Max's bake settings and stuff, you don't run into too many problems. It's nice. Um, and I know I told you guys to use XNormal, but we've been having a lot of troubles with it recently. I don't know what's up with it, so we'll just do everything in Max, and we'll go from there. So I've went here and I've attached all of my low poly stuff together, so it's pretty high poly. And I'm not too worried about the poly count right now. I'm mainly worried about it actually just looking good and conforming really well. If I feel that these wires here later on are too high poly, I'll reduce them after all the baking's done. Because if I reduce them and they don't match my high poly anymore, I'll get weird stepping across them. And once they're baked, if I get rid of them, then it'll just be optimized, but all the detail will still be there and it'll be nice and crisp. So, so this is my low poly for the most part. I think there's supposed to be something here. These wires just kind of end. Weird. Well, I'm going to deal with that later. That's fine for now. Just noticed that. Anyway, so it's pretty simple. I may have to edit it at some point, but once you're kind of happy with it, stick with it. So that's number one. Number two is smoothing groups. So right now I have some crazy smoothing groups on these little guys. They're all faceted. So smoothing groups are basically how smooth things look. So you see here these cylinders or these pipes look really nice and smooth, even though they're probably, maybe like a little bit more high poly than these guys. And when we model stuff, when we do splines, they kind of all set up their smoothing groups on their own. If you want to play around with smoothing groups, you could do them manually in Max here by going to your face select and playing around with the smoothing groups in here. So if I selected this one smoothing group and turned it off 1 and put it to 12, I would have this one flat little square there, which you don't want. But anyways, if you guys do want to manually play around with them, you can. There's also a smooth modifier, which I quite enjoy. If you just put it on by default, it'll turn all smoothing groups to 0, like to null. So then everything will have its own smoothing group, which will look obviously really bad. And then if you put on auto, it'll pick a threshold, so it'll kind of do every 30 degrees. If it's within a 30-degree threshold, it'll have the same smoothing group. Anything after that, it'll break apart. Typically, this does a really nice job. You see here, it cleaned up all this, and it's quite nice. Now, when you're baking, smoothing groups are going to be a little bit different than when you're actually finished your mesh. Sometimes you may want to crank your smoothing groups a little bit higher. So for instance, I have this handle here and it has this harder cut across here. If I crank this too high, everything's going to start getting really bubbly. Bubbliness isn't necessarily bad when you're capturing normals. When something's this bubbly, you may get a nicer normal kind of across this stuff, but all kind of depends on what you're kind of after. So, oh shit, I set that back to 0. Okay, so it's gonna freak out for a bit. Okay, so I set this to 30, and if there's something that I don't like, after that I'm gonna go through and manually change it. So let's say this handle here, I don't like how faceted this is. So I'm gonna select these guys up here, and find out they're smoothing group 3. These guys are 2, and this thing is 4. So if I just put this to 3, it will conform to this guy, and if I also make him 2, then it'll smooth out there, and I'll get a much nicer kind of look to it. And this is probably something that I'm going to want to keep for my final, but I definitely want to fix that up for my bake because it's going to look really weird without it. So do a quick kind of glance over your mesh and make sure your smoothing groups look really good. Alright, make sure everything's looking fine, nothing's too crazy. These guys look good. Alright, so far so good. So we're done our low poly side of things as far as the actual model. The last thing I do is I want to make sure that this guy is somewhere good in world space. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take his pivot, I'm going to effect pivot only, and I'm going to set my pivot to 0, 0, 0. So I went to effect pivot only, change that. I selected my move tool. I right clicked on my move tool to get this little guy up here. And then I right clicked on all these guys just to get them all zeros. The reason I'm doing that is I'm going to also do that to the high poly because they should have the same pivot. That being said, we're baking in max now, so that doesn't really matter. It's more important when you're actually exporting stuff out. I just realized that it's actually not very important right now. But whatever, it's kind of force of habit, so let's look at that. Now, here comes the fun part. I'm going to unhide everything. I'm going to hide my low poly. I'm going to hide this base. I have this base that I built for like previewing purposes. I'm not making a texture for it, so I'm just going to hide it. This is my high poly. If I try and attach it all together, it's going to be, especially on this machine, it's going to take forever. It hates attaching high poly stuff together. It really does. It's just a nightmare. But I need to for my bake. It just needs to be all one. It really sucks. So pick whatever. I picked this base. Doesn't matter what it is. And as long as your low poly is hidden, right? When you can convert one of your guys to an edible poly or mesh. I may do mesh because mesh is a little faster, might like it a little better. You can bring up attach list, which will eventually bring up a list of all the objects in your scene. It should not have your low poly in here, but just make sure it doesn't. So it's pretty good. These attach lists are quite nice. They respect hidden objects, which is good. And then I can just select everything and attach. So I'm going to do that, but obviously I'm going to end the video because that's probably going to take like half an hour. So attach it all. Make sure you save a backup before you do that and all that stuff because, again, attaching really, really sucks. But you're going to need that, and it's going to suck. So anyways, that's the end for that one. And then